Welcome to SmithWeekly Discussions, an occasional program for our readers and listeners of SmithWeekly Research. Please note this program is a private discussion and everything contained herein is for entertainment and educational purposes only. With that, we hope you're in a comfortable position, along with your favorite beverage, to enjoy the discussion. We remind our audience to examine the show notes attached to each of our shows to better understand how our program functions. Before we get into our discussion, we want to say thanks for questions coming from our audience at SmithWeekly, including Joe G., Jared W., and Paul M. Joining us today is Mycle Schneider. Mycle is convening lead author and publisher of the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. He is also founding board member and spokesperson of the International Energy Advisory Council. Mycle is also a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. You can learn more about Mycle's work by visiting worldnuclearreport.org and also IEAC.info. Mycle, it's been a pleasure, and Thank you for accepting our invite to come on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, Mycle, there's a lot of other stuff I missed in your introduction, so why don't you give the audience a background and tell us about your work you do in the energy sector and specifically in nuclear energy.
Well, I've been working as an independent analyst and consultant on energy and nuclear policy for, it's now over 35 years, I guess. I have been working for a number of years for several governments at the same time in France and Belgium and Germany. I've worked for over 30 years now with politicians, MPs from various countries, in particular from the European Parliament. And I've advised a very broad range of clients, from think tanks to universities to investors or NGOs, any people that work professionally on energy policy issues.
An extensive background. I encourage people to listen and look at your bio on the different websites I provided. Now, you are in progress with finishing up the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report for 2019. Tell us, if you can, a little bit about when this report will be ready, the main points and trends and things you want to convey to the readers of that report.
Yeah, the report has been out now annually for over a decade, pretty much since 2007 in various formats, and it's now pretty much the only independent reference there is as an annual report. It's an international team. This year we have 8 authors from 6 countries, including 3 university professors, one from Canada, from Japan, one from Germany. And we have the founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute, Amory Lovins, as a contributing author, who is probably quite well known amongst your listeners as well. So it's an interdisciplinary international team that does a multi-criteria trend analysis. That's the whole idea. I tend to think that energy policy needs to be looked at over the long term and by multi-indicators. It doesn't really make sense to pick out one and discuss it. You really have to look at a whole range of indicators to understand what the status and trends are. And I guess what we have seen since the WNISR 2018 came out a year ago is a further differentiation, like the gap is widening between nuclear power on one hand and its main competitors, which today have turned out, over the past few years being renewables. Whereas even if you think back 5 years, people spoke about the natural gas bridge today that's pretty much gone. We have a situation where, for the first time, in countries like India, we have new solar that is actually competing with existing coal. We have situations now in the US where new solar and wind is combined with storage can compete with average prices of nuclear power in the market. So we're seeing sort of the situation is not getting easier for nuclear power in the market sector.
And I appreciate you sharing some of that information there. Now, when is the report coming out?
So the report is coming out on the 24th of September. It will be released at the Central European University in Budapest. And there will be presentations in various countries after that, including the US, in Washington, D.C. on the 7th of October, and likely in Chicago on the 8th of October. And there will be presentations in Poland and in other European countries, in Paris, in Vienna, in Slovakia. So there's a whole range of, in China as well. We have had translations of parts of the report, and in 2017 the entire report in Chinese. So there's a broad interest in this reference document now.
And Mycle, you mentioned earlier you consult for various governments and organizations. Can you, and you just spoke just a little bit about some of the economics here with that are coming out on this report related to, solar and wind and other forms of energy competing with nuclear on a cost basis. Can you share with us, for some of those clients that you've consulted with in general, what do they want from you, and what do you generally tell them? Do you tell them all the same thing, or is each experience tailored to specific situations they face regarding energy in their country?
Oh, it's definitely tailored, but it's you see, when you this reference document is now an excellent basis for tailoring. It provides global data, and it does very specific assessments country by country. We always have a range of focus countries that are assessed in more depth. This annual work, which is continuous, obviously, to be able to put it out once a year, is providing the basis for tailoring for each client or each situation that might come up.
Okay, and you mentioned economic performance of nuclear power just a little bit. Can you expand a little bit on that on a global basis? Compare nuclear power economic performance with other competitor forms of energy.
Yeah, if we look at the latest assessments by Lazar Bank, which is sort of one of the best, we consider one of the best international references for LCOE's levelized cost of energy for various electricity generating technologies. What we've seen over the past decade is that large scale, utility scale solar has come down about 88%. Wind has come down 69%, and nuclear has actually increased over that same time period by 23%. So that's what I mean by widening gap. The renewable energy competitors are getting cheaper and cheaper, and nuclear power is actually getting more and more expensive. Now, why is that? I mean, that's obviously one of the questions. What we have seen in many countries is that the construction times are never what they were expected to be. So we have phenomenal delays in construction. And obviously, these delays are very expensive because, a multi-billion dollar facility is very costly to finance. So a year delay is an extremely expensive delay, not only because the power generation, so the money making is coming in later, but because financing is expensive. And we have seen, our assessment is always over a decade. For example, we look, 63 reactors have been connected to the grid over the past decade, and the average construction time was just under 10 years. And if we say construction, one has to be precise. Technically, the construction start is the concreting of the base slab of the reactor building. So obviously, there's a lot of time until a construction site gets to that stage. So we're talking times that are 15 years. Sometimes that are even much longer than that. And that is expensive, and that makes it very difficult for nuclear to compete. Now, why have we seen these delays? I guess one of the main, there's many reasons for that, but one of the main reasons really is quality assurance on the construction sites or in the factories. It has turned out very difficult even to provide concreting, welding, very basic, technical skills to the technical specifications needed in nuclear projects, and leading to situations as we've seen in France right now with the latest delay of the European pressurized water reactor, the EPR at Flamanville, which has been delayed by another 3 years because welds are not as they were supposed to be. They have defaults on the main steam line, which goes through the containment. They're not accessible. So basically, one has to destroy part of the containment and rebuild it, redo the repair the welding and redo it. So you can imagine these are 8 welds. They will cost hundreds of millions of euros, if not more, just to repair. So we have seen, this is only one example, but we've seen this on a very long list of technical problems that these new projects have seen all over the planet.
Right, and you mentioned I want to get over to France on some other topics here in a moment. Now you mentioned kind of first concrete pour for the base slabs. You've done a fair amount of work over in Asia, Mycle. Now specifically on China, with the exception of the announcements that construction for 3 projects are going ahead, just recently announced, I believe it was in July, there hasn't been any new reactor construction groundbreaking since 2016. What are your thoughts on China and their nuclear construction?
Yeah, China obviously was the big exception over the past decade. It was basically the only country that has been massively building. Of the 63 reactors that I have mentioned before, I think it's 37 that are Chinese. So very successful, comparatively speaking, a program. But China, you can put it this way: China has been building nuclear reactors as it has been building any other infrastructure. Nuclear power was by no means any different. It was not perceived as something specific. they built nuclear plants as they built factories, roads, and other infrastructure projects until Fukushima happened. And Fukushima was 311 was really a major shock for decision makers wherever they were, whether they were in government or in industry. It was a real profound shock. As nuclear power was not a non-issue prior to that, as some Chinese colleague put it to me at some point, saying, we discovered nuclear power with Fukushima, and that's not, discovering a technology by an accident, a major one, is probably not a very good way to discover a technology. So this led to a major freeze for about 4 years, and what they basically let the projects that were way ahead, they let them finish. And there were a few that were in the pipeline just before breaking ground that they also let go. But people didn't really realize that freeze that happened. And then, and by 2015, there were a few additional authorizations. But, the overall number of units that started building, went basically down from 10 in, one has to imagine in 2010, there were 15 construction starts in the world, of which 10 in China. And it has gone down, in 2011, there was 0. And in 2000, and then there were a few in between, and we have the last commercial reactor construction startup in December 2016. So it really is the impact of Fukushima that has played a very major role, and a very unusual debate inside the country is whether inland reactors are acceptable or not. This debate has not taken place in any other country, but it's a very significant and major debate in China. And so far, none of the reactors had been licensed as inland reactors. So it is, together with the debate about which technology to use, it's very clearly now that there will not be any major new build of Generation 2 reactors. So they have been developing their own Generation 3 model. They did have very bad experiences also with building EPRs in China, although they were started up over the past year, which is of course big news for the developers. But these 6 reactors, 4 AP1000s and 2 EPRs, they took around 9 years to build. 9 years, which was roughly twice as long as they thought it would take. And the Chinese industry and government doesn't really like that. I mean, that wasn't the plan. So all these various factors make that there is a big slowdown in the program, and China will miss by far its target in the 5-year plan for 2020, which was 58 gigawatts operating and 30 gigawatts in the course of construction. And what we have now is we probably will have 51 operating at the most, and we currently have like 9 under construction, depending on how much it will be. It will remain in any case way, way below the 5-year target.
Right. Yeah, certainly behind their ambitions. There's no doubt about that. Now, since Fukushima, you've seen some of these other countries start to pop up with programs, and of course, Russia really pushing that outsourcing of running around the world and really offering up a number of packages to build out. Rosatom is probably one of the hardest working, from what I've seen, one of the hardest working organizations on export of nuclear power outside of Russia. Since Fukushima, has the Fukushima effect started to wear off in your view, where you see some of these other countries starting to start these programs? Maybe, for example, UAE and Saudi Arabia starting to explore and potential do some building?
I don't think so. I mean, there's nothing really on the ground, which is obviously with the exception of UAE, and you're right to point this out. But this was a very particular case, right? I mean, it's the first Korean project outside the country. They likely lose a lot of money in this project. It was very ambitious, to start with 4 reactors as a newcomer country, but in the end, they weren't able to deliver as planned neither. They have now accumulated several years of delay, so it doesn't really turn out as planned. There are, the plans of Saudi Arabia have been around for a long time. It's like, we have seen 2 new countries past year. When I say past year, it's mid 2018 or beginning of 2018 to mid 2019, which is Turkey and Bangladesh. But the Turkish plant has been talked about for 40 years. And Bangladesh is both are Russian projects, and you're perfectly right that Russia is the most aggressive on the international market, but it's not really working out that well for Russia, and it will be a big question to what extent Russia will be able to come up with the financing that it promises. If you look at the performance at home, Russia has connected to the grid 8 reactors in the past decade. The average construction time was 22 years. I mean, what kind of business card is that? Obviously, with a very large range from 8 to 35 years. So and in other countries, it's not really brilliant neither. The last units that have been started up in India, basically the Indians blame the Russians blame the Indians, but the reactors don't operate as they should be operating. So Russia is very, very aggressive from a commercial point of view, but in terms of what is happening on the ground, it's not really convincing.
Right. And with China and India being really close to a little shy of 40% of global population, if my numbers are correct, just those 2 countries combined, I mean, billions of people. What is the solution for such a massive demand that's coming down the pipe with those 2 countries? What do you see as an ideal solution for them?
It's very difficult to give an answer to such a question. What is an ideal solution? I think I'm as I said, I'm a big fan of empirical analysis. What we're seeing right now in both countries is this huge growth in renewable energies. I mean, with China having as we said earlier, the only really large nuclear power program in terms of building, it is still providing more power with wind alone than with nuclear power. And solar power is catching up incredibly fast. And the same is true for India. So, India, there's actually now 10 countries that generate more power, 10 nuclear countries, 10 of the 31 nuclear countries generate actually more power with renewables than they generate with nuclear power, which is very interesting. It's obviously a rather recent development, and South Africa was added to these countries over the past year. I think it's when we look at the numbers in terms of investments, we had China for 2017 with 126 billion as by far the largest investor. That has been increased. That was an early estimate to 146 billion dollars invested in 1 year. I mean, the U.S. invests 41, 42, around $40 billion. The Chinese investment plunged in 2018 to around, that's the early estimate, so one has to be careful, but it's around 90 billion because they cut incentives especially for solar, and because of the price drop. The prices continue to drop. The last figures I've seen for the US is 13% in 1 year for wind and solar. So China and India, I think they still have a huge potential in wind and solar and continue that route. And obviously, it's all with the it's like how did Amory Lovins say? It's like an orchestra. One has to fine tune the combination of electricity generating sources, and one has to. There's another issue in the background, is that we need to stop filtering out electricity. I mean, we have to talk energy, and if you do that, you realize that what is at stake is much more, of course, than electricity. A country like France that still generates more than 70% of its electricity by nuclear power. If you look at final energy, it's around 17%. And it's interesting because if you talk final energy in a country like Germany, which has still a very significant share of coal in its electricity generation, but it's just below 17% final energy. And it's back to India and China. I think there is a lot of the potential is enormous that is still out there for renewables to be built up. And not to forget, China has made significant advances in energy efficiency, which is obviously the first thing to do.
It's always fascinating for us, kind of on the money side a little bit, thinking about these prices of renewable continue to fall, and how at the end of the day, how are the margins at the end for the operators is always a question that we've yet to fully answer as we continue to drop these costs down. And of course, then the last thing is in a big credit cycle situation like we've experienced in the U.S. and quite an expansion of credit over the last 10 years, how this will continue to go when things in the market turn around. And of course, we have the inevitable bear market in finance that eventually will come again. I want to focus on France because I know you've done a lot of work there, and of course yourself spending a lot of time in France as well. What is your position on the French abandonment of the Generation 4 reactor development?
Yeah, that is an interesting. It for me also personally, it kind of goes full cycle, because when I started out in 1983 working on these issues, my first major topic was Super Phoenix, was the French fast breeder reactor, and by the middle of the 80s, to me it was already clear that the breeder reactors had no reason to be anymore, because let's go back in history. That the first nuclear power plant that generated electricity was the EBR-1 in the U.S., which was an experimental breeder reactor. So the idea of breeder reactors has been around ever since nuclear electricity has been generated. Of course, EBR-1 had a partial meltdown after, which was not so good. In France, Super Phoenix was a technological failure. It had the worst load factor of any nuclear plant that has ever been operated in France. But the key thing here is that, the breeders were supposed to produce plutonium that was supposed to be substituted for natural uranium. And we'll have a very nice graph in our upcoming report. If you look back in 1974, by the middle of the 70s, the forecasting was for the development of nuclear power. Then what was labeled the most likely scenario of the IAEA was something like 3,600 gigawatts installed by year 2000. That's more than 10 times what reality was. So the effect of that is very simple, is that there was never any shortage of uranium. And of course, we've seen a depressed natural uranium market for quite some time now. With the situation of nuclear reactors being what it is, meaning, this is actually a population that will die out. It's only a question of time. So there is no pressure on the supply of natural uranium. So there's no pressure on substituting with plutonium. So this whole idea of breeders is actually has become obsolete under the current circumstances. So the decision by the French government to abandon the latest model that they had in mind, called Astrid, is a very logical thing to do. What is not logical is that they have maintained the plutonium separation industry, because they always kept that myth alive that one day they will be able to use plutonium that is bad quality, coming from light water reactor, spent light water reactor fuel that would be reprocessed, and that plutonium would be used in breeders. That's now over, and which means that there should be an entire strategy rethink for the French system.
Interesting. Yeah, and certainly there's no doubt there's plenty of cheap uranium around. I think where the bottleneck is those people losing the incentive to go out and get it because it's so cheap. And so that's an interesting situation that's developing in the uranium mining market. Now, I want to ask you about, the French had delayed the phase down of some of their nuclear power, I believe, if my memory serves, out to like 2035. What is going on, and why the delay with getting rid of the French, or at least reducing the mix of nuclear in France?
That's a complex question. I'll try to answer that, giving you a few elements, but it might not be exhaustive. One of the elements that are having been put forward is the climate debate, saying that they would need to, run more gas or higher carbon content options, which has been basically debunked as an argument. It would have been feasible at the original deadline that was set in the previous law, which was 2025. But there's another issue, and it's very much linked to what we were discussing earlier. France has a strategy currently where it's a flow of spent fuel that is going from the power plants to the La Hague facility. Now, the problem is the pools are filling up in the power plants, and the pools are filling up at La Hague. So there is a problem on one hand, that if they don't do reprocessing, then they will run out of capacity of storage within a few years. And one can discuss, is it 5 years, is it 4, is it 6? It depends on throughput. It depends. There's various parameters, of course, but it's only a few handful of years. And it's shaky because you could, say strategy-wise, you slow down or you phase out reprocessing. But on the other hand, if you stop reprocessing, it also means, if you go ahead with reprocessing, you have plutonium to be disposed of. And, there is a diplomatic engagement by France not to increase stockpiles, even if it has gone counter that engagement for many years. But this rate would significantly increase if they shut down reactors, because it turns out that the oldest reactors and the most likely ones to go first are the ones that use light water reactor MOX. So you have it's kind of a tricky situation. It's a house of cards where if they stop reprocessing, there is a problem with spent fuel management. If they continue reprocessing, they have trouble shutting down their old reactors.
One of the other things that's frequently comes out is the French, in comparison to other countries in Europe, generally have a lower retail energy bill. Is that attributable to nuclear, or is it another factor that France enjoys there as far as lower cost of energy?
I actually really appreciate the way you put it in your first question. It's the question of the electricity bill. And the point is that the electricity bill is not much cheaper in France than it is, in other countries. The kilowatt hour is cheaper. But you see, the problem is if you have cheaper kilowatt hours and you use more kilowatt hours, your bill is going to be as high as at the neighbors. And one of the big problems we have in France is electric space heating. There's about 30% of the homes are electrically heated. I mean, electric space heating is pretty dumb in a context like that, because nuclear power is not really there to supply peak load. And you probably know that peak load in Europe is in the winter and not in the summer, as in countries like the US. So what we're seeing is that more and more people are in trouble, and there is now 1 in 5 households is classified as energy poor in France. And one of the key reasons is the high consumption of kilowatt hours if you do electric space heating. Because of course, if let's say your electricity is 50% cheaper than in a neighboring country, but if you use 3 times as many kilowatt hours, you're in trouble anyway. So what happened is a lot of households, they now, for legal reasons, cannot be cut off electricity during the winter. So they keep heating during the winter, and they have a huge bill when they come out of the winter and get cut off electricity. As soon as it becomes legal again. So the price. Therefore, it's the right way you have put the question. It's the question: how high is the electricity bill, and not, how expensive is the kilowatt hour.
Well, I want to move over to another subject. In your view, what do the changes in the nuclear industry mean for this advanced nation debate on climate change and global warming?
Yeah, this is really a key issue, of course, and we will have in our report for the first time a dedicated chapter on climate change and nuclear power. Now, what is of utmost importance here is that the key question in the climate change debate is, if I spend $1, a yen, or a euro, how much emissions reduction I can buy and how fast. So it's the combination of effectiveness of investment combined with the time factor. And of course, it's interesting to see that the whole idea of climate emergency is something relatively new. You know that more and more cities and regions have declared their administrative region in a state of climate emergency, which stresses the time factor. Now, if we're spending $1, a euro, or a yen into the construction of a new nuclear power plant as a tool for mitigating climate change, it's the worst option because it combines a very high cost. And as we've said earlier, I mean, the costs are now ridiculously high. I mean, we're talking $150 per megawatt hour, maybe more for, leave alone projects we will never figure out maybe, but like Flamanville or Hinkley Point C. The feed-in tariff there that was negotiated was 92.5 pounds per megawatt hour. That is like twice the market price, the wholesale market price. I mean, who makes a deal like that? It's a very strange way to make guaranteed prices. So it's a very high. It comes in at a very high cost, but it's not only the high cost. It's also very slow. As we've said earlier, the average construction time is 10 years. I've seen recent announcements for large wind projects that go from project phase that have now pushed the time below 1 year of lead time. So new nuclear power is the worst option when it comes to fighting climate change because it's the most expensive and it's especially the slowest. Now, the second question is, of course, but we have a lot of installed nuclear power. So what about existing nuclear power plants? And there, the assessment is really, it's more complicated because it's deliverable. You know that in the United States, a certain number of individual states have given utilities what they call zero emission credits, which is nothing but a direct, brutal subsidy for a number of years. But that doesn't solve really the issue, does it? I mean, it only stretches a lifetime of these reactors for a few years at a very high cost. So that cost has to be put into perspective with other options. But it's also the dynamic that is created. If you take look at the comparison of the post 3/11 political decisions in a country like Germany and compare it to Japan. Germany, within 4 months, created a comprehensive legislative package that not only phased out nuclear power. It gave a target of a 10-year horizon, but it also had a very extensive package on energy efficiency and on renewables. But for an investor, it's dreamland. You have fixed target dates when, let's say, 1,300 megawatts go offline. that gap can be filled with a target date. That's the perfect investment guarantee. What did Japan do? Japan basically after 3/11 said, well, we will try to restart as many reactors as we can. Well, we're now in the 8th year after 3/11, and there's 9 reactors that have restarted, and there's, by and by more and more reactors that actually are being declared closed, even if it was clear for many years that a lot would not come online. But what they have is a situation which is a total uncertainty. So for investors, they don't know. Will they restart? Will they not restart? How many will restart? When? Nobody knows. And so it's a situation of investment insecurity. And I think that with that situation, there is also, in an environment like Germany, there's an incredible stimulation for innovation, which is blocked. There's nothing more powerful than a large-scale operating a power plant. By the way, whether it's nuclear or coal or anything else, it's a very powerful innovation barrier. And it's all the more interesting that I'm using the term innovation not only in the technological sense, but also in the sense of market tools, of new business models. For example, in Germany, the energy co-ops have, there's now about 1,000 co-ops, and they're very major investors. We're talking multi-billion investment through co-ops. So new business models, new investor parts, and the old utilities have basically, kept their old style, and with what we've seen as an effect, with an erosion of their market share, which in many cases is has been more than halved. Some have lost, including the French utilities, over 80%. So I think it's from a climate perspective crucial to, in many cases when it comes to power generation or energy services, providing heat, providing cold, lighting, etc. You will do that with renewables.
Well, tell us, I want to move on to another subject. Why do experiments in energy often go wrong? And tell us about the intelligent energy services concept.
Often when you work for decades on something, you come back in the end to something real simple. And I think one of the reasons why we have such great difficulties to get to the fundamentals is that we keep talking about barrels of oil and cubic meters of gas and kilowatt hours, which is actually not the crucial thing. What is crucial is what comes with it, and those are energy services. And by energy services, I mean primary energy services, and there's only 6 categories. It's cooked food, it's lighting, it's heating and cooling, it's mobility, it's communication, and it's motor force. 6 categories. You couldn't put your entire life, everything that has to do with energy, you can put into one of those categories. So the question is how to provide these services. And I can give an example how difficult it is. I've been involved since 2013, working with a group of consultants that I have established that have been appointed by the mayor of Seoul in South Korea to advise them on their Sustainable Energy Action Plan, and which has many components. And I just want to take one example, that is lighting. Seoul has probably one of the largest, if not the largest, LED program ever. because it had, targeted all public buildings with very stiff deadlines and a very high ratio of switching to LEDs from other lighting systems in a very short time. But I have been had been suggesting from day one is to boost daylighting. And here we have a typical example. Daylighting is a very well-studied issue. People feel better, people are healthier. Large companies like Boeing or Lockheed have used it, and the basic outcome there is, going to daylighting from artificial lighting has very fast. Is a very effective investment because the energy savings, give you like four-year payback times. But if you assess what is considered co-benefits, and I'm just quoting two. One is the absenteeism that drops 15%. 15% drop in absenteeism, and productivity increases by 15%. If that is the case, then forget about the energy savings. The economic benefit of using daylighting is much larger than the energy savings. So my saying is that we should do fabrication facilities, offices, schools, where people feel well, they are productive, make less mistakes. And as a side effect, we're saving energy, and obviously we're saving emissions big time. So and back to the example in Seoul, this, daylighting, and even 5 years after, there's no program on daylighting. It's just, it didn't sink in that, what is crucial is the service that goes with it, and not only the saved kilowatt hours.
Well, it's a very interesting concept that you bring up. I want to move on. Does nuclear energy have a role to play in the future of energy, or are you of the opinion that it's really on the decline at this point?
Well, if nuclear power was a living organism, it would be on the list. It would have been on the list of endangered species for a long time. We look every year. We look at, the construction rate it would take to maintain the current status, leave alone any extension, any enlargement of the current fleet. And to put it in a rough figure, I have said we've been looking in detail on construction and over the past. So we know there was 63 reactors that have been connected to the grid over the past decade. If you project into the future and you look at 40-year lifetime and licensed lifetime extensions, you would have to triple the building ratio over the coming decade in order to break even, to triple. But meanwhile, what we're seeing is actually a decline in construction starts. We had, the historic peak, and that clarifies the orders of magnitude. We had a peak of reactors under construction, like the total number of reactors under construction, of 234 units in the 70s. We have had a maximum of 44 construction starts in the 70s in 1 year. We have seen a decline to virtually zero 25 years ago, and then people started talking about this renaissance, and we have seen indeed a kind of a little hill of 15 in 2010. Now, these 15 have been eroded, construction starts eroded to 5 in 2018, 5 in 2017, and 1 so far in 2019. You cannot maintain a fleet with such a small renewal rate. It will die out. It's just a matter of time. You know, how long the lifetime extensions are implemented. We are seeing now that outages, we did a very precise analysis, and it's going to be in the report. We're showing that the number of outage days, reactor outage days with zero electricity generation in France is over 5,000, in 5,000 reactor days in France. In other words, it's close to 3 months on average that the reactors were not producing any power. In Belgium, it was half a year, like half the actual generation was less than half. And the key reason is that outages get extended because of aging. And we've seen only 2 years so far in nuclear history where an average of 40 years was reached from shutdown reactors, and that was in 2016 and 2018. So there is no industrial experience with reactors of 60 years operation, and it's, you know, what we've seen is reactors are shut down much earlier because of economic reasons in particular.
Well, as you know, there's no source of energy that is perfect. What are your thoughts on this so-called green energy boom, at least the term green that people have put in front of energy? Does all energy have some form of impact because it costs something and consumes something?
Well, as I said, you know, to me, it's the big mistake there is to look at it from a supply side. We need to look at issues from a service side. It's not even exclusive demand, because you can also look at it from a kilowatt hour or from a quantitative way. We need to look at the qualitative way and at the energy service supplied. It's fascinating what you can do with zero, fuels, simply by, today we can build homes that are energy plus. That's their name. They generate more energy than they consume. The key issue here really is it's not to say this is good or bad energy. It's to be smart and provide energy services the intelligent way, which means to use everything that you can call passive. It's not really a happy term because what we have to invent another term, but it's like insulation first. It's like daylighting first. It's it's to optimize the efficient provision of energy services. You know that you can light a room by light shelves inside and outside the window and replace artificial lighting. There are some very simple solutions, and there are very complex solutions to do the same thing. So that is, to me, really the key. This is my policy advice to decision makers: is take it from the energy service, very simple way, and then put together a response strategy that places that has certain priorities. And one of the priorities is passive first, then active, local first, then regional, then national, then international. So that putting together a policy strategy that is oriented at the real service needs, and not at some kind of needs of or quantification on supplies from the supply side.
Well, you bring some good points. Mycle, you had said something to me earlier before we did the show. Why are you not interested in the pro-con debates about nuclear, and how does that relate to your favorable opinion of empirical analysis when it comes to looking at the data?
You know, I always find it's the nuclear issue is kind of strange. There's all kinds of people that debate about the nuclear issue that have no clue about the nuclear industry. And I think, you know, to me, it's looking at the facts. It sounds like a, you know, very basic statement, but it's amazing to what extent there is a misunderstanding about the performance of nuclear power, and I think one should do that first, and then one can take, you know, it's debatable if I'm saying, you know, my analysis empirically shows that this is an endangered species, because the industry has not delivered as they have promised over the past decades, and you know, therefore, you know, tripling the building rate would not work. So what I'm saying is, other people can say, hang on, this might change, right? I mean, maybe the industry is now or will be in a position, you know, to build faster, better, et cetera, et cetera. Except that all the indicators are going the other direction. You know, building times don't get better. The largest historic builder, Westinghouse, went bankrupt. The French counterpart, Areva, government held, went bankrupt. So I'm saying if people have other interpretations, then they have to come up with the evidence. I'm coming up with the evidence based on, you know, of what history shows, and I come to certain conclusions. But I don't think the pro and con debate is completely sterile. I don't think that brings us any further. We have to look at the facts, and then and then we can discuss about what conclusions shall be drawn from the facts. Does that make sense? I mean, do you know what I mean?
Yes, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that. No, absolutely. No, I think you have an interesting position on that, and I think people should look into it and consider that. Mycle, for the people who want to do some of their own research on energy and the topics we've discussed today, what sources have you kind of found? Can you share with us a couple credible sources that you've found over your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's an interesting topic. Sources. We spend a huge amount of time of referencing the sources we use in the World Nuclear Industry Status Report. I think there's now over 1,200 in the report. So it's not like one or two or five. It's like we're using a very large number of sources. When it comes to utility data, the situation has dramatically changed with the liberalization of the energy markets. Like, we have access today to utility data which we have never seen before. Like, we can, you know, there's, and I really recommend people to look at what the grid agencies and the utilities do today, and also in terms of making it visually understandable. You know, real time, for example, real time composition of the energy mix in the grid is available today. That has dramatically changed over the past years. Otherwise, obviously, there's only a few sources for worldwide information, and I must say that the people at BP do a great job with their statistical work, It's definitely the fastest out there. They do incredible. It's an incredible team to come up in June with data on the previous year, even if obviously the numbers get corrected. And then there's the Global Renewables Report, which has become a sort of a very good reference, and the UNEP and Frankfurt School is now not doing their own. I've seen with some surprise, they're not doing their own assessment on investments anymore. They feed it into the Global Renewables Report. So those are a few sources which might be useful for readers.
Now, Mycle, first, how can people get your latest annual report? And then how can they learn more about you and also potentially connect with you?
The report will be available on the 24th of September at the website, dedicated website for the annual report, which is World Nuclear Report in one word.org. There is profiles of the lead authors and contributing authors on the website. There is also a website of the International Energy Advisory Council that I'm a co-founder of, and that had its first project, the advice of the city of Seoul, and has done other projects since then. There is an interesting there's a PDF of a book that the Seoul Metropolitan Government has released in 2017 on their energy action plan, which also contains a chapter I have authored on the intelligent energy services concept, which people might find useful. And both websites have data on my bio. Otherwise, it's also, people can go to mycleschneider.com.
Well, Mycle, really appreciate you coming on to take the time to share with us your insights. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I think it's a great format to have more time to discuss things in more detail.